Welcome to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager, and our co-host is curator Dr. Ollie Douglas. In the past year of recording these episodes, we keep encountering two recurring themes. The first is land, how it's used, shared, cared for, and taken away, the laws that control access, and the people and even the giants who fight against them. The second is the name Guy Shrubsole, the brilliant author, campaigner, and co-founder of Right to Roam, a contemporary campaigning group that fights to improve responsible access to England's green spaces. There's also a bonus third theme, which is the fact that we keep talking about the film The Advocate, which neither Ollie or I have seen, where Colin Firth plays a lawyer representing a medieval French pig. And it gives me immense pleasure to say that this episode combines all three of these in one. This is the first of two episodes with Guy Shrubsole about his work, campaigns, and the story of trying to figure out who really owns England, which is much more complex and expensive than you might think. We're about to travel from Brexit in 2016 to as far back as William the Conqueror and the Norman conquest. So seatbelts on, watch out for arrows, and hope you enjoy listening as much as we enjoyed recording. Welcome to Absolute Units, Guy.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Feels like this has been a long time coming, Joe.
Yeah.
I think we probably talk about Guy and his work most episodes now. So it's really good to have you with us.
Thank you. Well, that's really nice of you. And obviously, I love Mel. I love Absolute Units. And it's a joy to be on.
So obviously, we've read your books, Guy. I wonder whether we could start by thinking about your books, which you've been churning out every couple of years for the last few years. Who Owns England back in 2019, and then The Lost Rainforests of Britain in 2022, and most recently, The Lie of the Land in 2024. Could you talk us through the books and where the inspiration came for them and how they connect to each other?
Yes, sure. So starting off with Who Owns England, I mean, that actually began almost 10 years ago as a blog. I started it kind of for two reasons, really. One was because I've kind of always been an environmental campaigner. I was working for Friends of the Earth at the time. I was working on flood risk in the UK and how the climate crisis is increasing flooding. And I was getting really interested in how land was being used and abused, but I was also really interested in actually who owned the land in our upland areas where we were seeing increasing flood risk and sort of water washing off of catchments and flooding people's front rooms and so on. Then I started realizing how difficult it was to actually understand who owned land in this country, how much of a secret it still was, how it was, the information was locked behind paywalls and could only be found from various obscure sources. But then something else happened 10 years ago, which was Brexit. And a lot of the time during the Brexit campaign, we'd been hearing that this was all about taking back control. The Leave side was sort of saying we need to take back control from Brussels. And I sort of started thinking, well, I'd like to understand really who does actually have proper control over this country. And in my view, one of those groups is the people who owns the land itself. So by those two routes, I ended up setting up this website called Who Owns England and started researching this question. Just got really fascinated by it, absolutely obsessed by it, really, because it is like a kind of a detective story in many ways of trying to piece together the clues that I could find of who owns land. And I started working with lots of people and lots of data geeks and people who are really good at doing GIS mapping, digital mapping, and investigative journalists who'd been looking into one or other aspect of this question, and kind of started to piece together bits of the puzzle and started to get a real sense of not only how secret land ownership is in England, but also how unequal it is and how concentrated land ownership is. And eventually ended up thinking there's actually enough material here for a book. This really deserves a kind of book length treatment. And that's what led me to write Who Owns England. My second book, The Lost Rainforests of Britain, has a slightly different kind of starting point. And that was very simply the fact that I ended up moving to Devon about 5 years ago. I'd previously lived in other wet and rainy parts of the west of Britain. I lived in North Wales for 3 years earlier in my life and got to see some examples of what I now know to be temperate rainforest. But I didn't really sort of get into and start to understand this wonderful habitat until I moved to live down in Devon and started exploring these amazing wet woodlands that I found across sort of Dartmoor and the southwest, and started reading about them. And various ecologists had been referring to them over the years as temperate rainforests, and that they had something in common with the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest of America, the temperate rainforests of New Zealand. And it turns out that there are temperate rainforests on the western seaboard of Britain in places like Dartmoor and Cornwall, Devon, large parts of Wales, all the way up to the Lake District and up into the west coast of Scotland. And I was just fascinated by these places. That just became this kind of, again, this sort of quest to try and seek them out when I could. And I guess there was a link there to my first book insofar as I was interested also in who are the people who owned and looked after these temperate rainforests, but also who were the people who perhaps in the past had contributed to their devastation and to the overgrazing that we see so much of in the uplands of Britain today that prevents the regeneration of trees and of our natural woodland. And, so that was a kind of crossover. And I guess that ultimately also led to my third and most recent book, which is The Lie of the Land, which is in some ways is a follow-on book from Who Owns England, but is also really a book about land use. It's about how land is used and abused and misused in this country and who is doing it, and trying to kind of really interrogate this idea of stewardship, of the custodianship of land, and whether it's more greenwash than reality. And looking at all the ways in which actually a very small number of very large landowners have caused outsized ecological harm in Britain. And then what do we do about it? How can we make decisions about how land is used more democratic, more equal, and end up doing more to restore nature in the process?
It's fascinating. I mean, I love the language you've just used to describe that. You referred to yourself as kind of like a detective, and then you talked about interrogating. And it feels like at the heart of a lot of this work is that there is this kind of mystery or kind of almost like theft has been perpetuated that we're really not mindful of. Like the idea of who actually controls England, who owns all this land is so opaque and obscure. And at the same time, it's almost like a mystery that not that many people are even aware of existing.
Yeah, definitely. And I should say that, and I very much talk about this in my books, and my books, if anything, are kind of history books, really. I studied history at university, and that's really my sort of my way into a lot of these things is to try and look at the history of this stuff. But, there are a whole kind of chain of people who have championed and pioneered investigations into land ownership and questions of land reform in the recent past. And some of my heroes are people like Marion Shord, who wrote about this first in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, with her books like The Theft of the Countryside and This Land is Our Land. And she was really kind of pioneering a lot of these, asking these questions. And similarly, people like Andy Whiteman in Scotland, who wrote Who Owns Scotland, which was a very direct inspiration for the blog that I started and then for the book that I wrote. Amazing forensic research, investigation, still ongoing, very much in Andy's case, into the question of who owns Scotland. And I guess just fascinating. And I think kind of to me how this has been, kind of this information has been buried or kind of airbrushed out of public consciousness. Because I think it's so fundamental, really. It's really fundamental about who owns land and how we use it, because it underpins everything from, how we grow our food, where we, how do we solve the crisis in affordable housing? How do we solve the climate crisis? How do we increase the area of our natural carbon sinks and, knit back together this fraying tapestry?
It's like the root of everything. All of these issues, the idea of ownership is at the heart of it.
Land underpinning things. It's a common thread of our podcast as well. And it's great to hear Marion Shore get a shout out, because one of her books is sitting in a drawer in our current gallery trail alongside one of your books, Guy. So it's good to be making those connections.
Well, it's a great honour to be put next to her. Yeah.
There's a kind of lineage to all of this, isn't there? There's a kind of long, deep history in all of your books. That sense of the historicity of things comes through really powerfully. And I think you mentioned the word steward, and I know that you explore the origins of that as in one of your books. And this came up in one of our podcasts, actually, because we spoke to the historian Dolly Jurgensen about medieval pigs. So I wonder whether you could tell us about the origins of stewardship and maybe also give us a little bit of a potted history of land ownership. No pressure for the historian in you, but Norman conquest onwards, what's happened?
Great. Well, let's try and do that. Let's try and rattle through it. But very firstly, I mean, stewardship. Yes, and my understanding of the etymology of steward is that it dates back to the Middle Ages, when a styward was the warden of a lord's pigsty, and so he or she looked after the swine for their master. And from there on, you get this sort of sense that custodianship, that stewardship, is about looking after something, to caring for something on behalf of someone else. So it's this attempt to kind of talk about a set of duties, a set of responsibilities, but it's something which I've often seen used in some ways as a shield for ownership. So instead of defining oneself as a landowner, you often find very large aristocratic landowners saying, "Oh, I'm just merely a steward. I'm merely a steward. I'm merely looking after this on behalf of someone else." We're never quite sure who that is. It might be the person's descendants, of course. It might be, of course, the rest of us who. But then you've got to ask the question of, okay, so what is actually being done in my name? Is the stewardship being practiced? Are we actually seeing good environmental outcomes on someone's estate, for example? And do the rest of us get a say over how that land is used? Do the rest of us get to have access to how that, to that land and to how it's being used currently? But to turn to the question of the history of land ownership in this country, well, I suppose you're asking me to summarise 1,000 years.
It's no biggie. Just
unless we've got
we've got a couple of hours, maybe even longer.
Well, I guess for me, you have to go back to the Norman conquest. And 1066, you had this huge change in the way in which land was owned and distributed in England. You had William the Conqueror coming over with his Norman barons, conquering the whole of England. And for the first time, really, the Crown stating that all land in England belonged ultimately to the Crown. And that anybody else who owned land owned it essentially through the sufferance of the Crown, through the monarch and the institution of the Crown. And kind of fantastic way to centralise power, but also to be able to have powers of patronage to give out that land to your nobility and to kind of get them to swear oaths of fealty to you. And this is essentially what William the Conqueror did. And there was a lot of land that was retained by the Crown after the Norman conquest, but also a lot of it was handed out to the barons who came over and took part in the conquest with King William. Some of the land was also given to the church, obviously very, very important at the time, very powerful politically as well as sort of spiritually. And we can actually be quite specific about some of these patterns of ownership back then, because we have, of course, William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book, which pretty much everybody has heard of. Everybody's heard of Doomsday Book. Very few people have heard of the second Doomsday Book. Perhaps we'll come to that one later.
I didn't realise there was a second Doomsday Book.
There you go.
Sequel.
Arguably, there's several sequels to Doomsday, but we'll come back to that later because they have.
For anyone who hasn't heard of the Doomsday Book, would you very quickly just describe what it is?
Very, very quickly, it is a survey that was carried out by the Crown of essentially settlements of essentially the owners of land and what they then ultimately owed the Crown in tax. And so it is this, incredibly important early record that sort of doesn't really have any equivalent in Western Europe at that time.
Although it's worth pointing out that it's Doomsday that's spelled DOME rather than Doomsday as in, a James Bond novel or something.
There is a link because, of course, it was called Doomsday because they saw it as being similar to the Last Judgment. It's sort of like that weighing in the balance of everything when you have to go up to the pearly gates or whatever, and you have to wait, to have your sins and your good deeds weighed up. It was kind of seen as that judgment of the Crown. So yes, there is that very, very ominous sense to it, and of course, very ominous for people having to pay taxes to the Norman lords at the time. But essentially, we can be quite clear about what the pattern was, and I think something like 17 to 20% of England at the time of Doomsday was owned directly by the Crown, by William. I think another 20% or so had been given to the church, which of course was not the Church of England at the time, that came later, but to the church. And about 50% was handed out to the Norman barons. So you have these 200 Norman barons or so who were given a huge chunk of England. And this is really important to still talk about. You might be sort of listening to this and going, great, this happened nearly 1,000 years ago. Why does it matter anymore? But fundamentally, this established the pattern. It created this pattern of concentrated ownership. It centralized that power over land in the Crown. And it created this landed aristocracy surrounding the court that actually does endure to this day, even down to some of the families of aristocrats who still own land in England today. So most notably, you have the Dukes of Westminster. Now, they obtained their title somewhat more recently, but the Grosvenor family very proudly date their lineage back to the Norman conquest. In fact, if you go to a part of Mayfair where they own land still today, there is a statue in one of the public squares there where it talks about this, and it says the Grosvenors, have held land in England since the Norman conquest. And in fact, the name Grosvenor is actually thought to derive from a nickname for Hugh Grosvenor, and it was given to him by probably some upstart peasants. It means the fat hunter.
Wow.
So there you go. There's this.
That seems so indicative of how, today that legacy back to the Normans is seen as a real achievement or a sort of culture and tradition. But actually, at its heart, there is that violence of the Norman conquest, and even within the name, you've got the sort of damnation of the people.
Exactly. And there's this famous interview that the 6th Duke of Westminster once gave. And when he was asked for some advice to give to young entrepreneurs on how they could succeed in modern Britain, and he said, sort of laconically, make sure they have an ancestor who was a very close friend of William the Conqueror. So this sort of sense that land and power and wealth and prestige and success are all intertwined in England, I do think does go back a very long way, and we can still see it today. But I think we should speed up this potted history because we're still stuck about.
We're in 1066. Yeah. We're a bit later than 1066, but not far. Yeah.
Exactly. One thing I'd also mention is that alongside this, essentially, this system of feudalism that William brought over and sort of imposed on England, that was one thing. But another thing that he innovated and created in England was a system of royal forests, in which they're not just simply areas of trees or woodland, as the name might suggest. They essentially mean places that are enclosed. They are sort of forested. To be forested is to sort of have some sort of fence around it, both legal and physical. And you get these still in names today, place names today, like the New Forest, which is a series of woodlands and heaths and open land, but also rather treeless places like the Forest of Dartmoor or the Forest of Exmoor. And they're called that because they date back to the era of when there were these royal forests. Essentially, they were hunting grounds for the crown. And their importance, really, to land ownership in England, I think, is because they had some very strict laws around them, around who was allowed to hunt what in them, and that everybody else who tried to take game, such as deer, venison, that they would subject to extremely cruel punishments if they poached in these royal forests.
And it's worth saying we're going to talk much more about hunting and the sort of tradition of hunting in the next episode.
Yes,
but just quickly to say, I had no idea about the etymology of forest.
That's right.
Fascinating.
That's right. So you have these places where essentially, the crown, either as landowner or as sort of, overlord of the laws of the land, is basically saying some people have a right to take game from here, but others do not. So you can start to see here the origins of things like the laws of trespass, where the landowner can exclude other people from their land. And this sets up things for, obviously long-running battles and disputes down through the centuries over access to land and to the fruits of the land. I think the next really important thing to talk about in terms of the history of land ownership in England is we can spool forward a whole 500 years to Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries. And obviously there are lots of reasons for why Henry VIII split from Rome and, his 6 wives and wanting to marry again and getting an heir to the throne and all these sorts of things and religious differences. But one of the really key reasons for why Henry ultimately wanted to dissolve the monasteries and seize all the church lands was because the church had a huge amount of land that was worth a lot of money and the crown wanted to get at it. So after all these centuries of the crown giving out land as patronage, you sort of had the crown becoming ever more cash-strapped as they embarked on, fruitless foreign wars. They found the limits of taxation through things like the poll tax and the peasants' revolt that occurred in the aftermath of attempting to levy unfair taxation on the whole population. You had the rise of Parliament when the barons went, "Oi, you can't actually tax us without us having a say over how the country's run." And so Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell hit upon, of course, Thomas Cromwell hit upon a handy pot of gold in the form of all of the church lands, which then became another source of land in which the crown could hand out as patronage to new members of the aristocracy or members of the court who were court favourites, in return for favours, whether loans or money or whatever. And one example of how that again has an influence on land ownership today is you get some of these families coming through at this time. So you get the Russells, for example, and the Russell family, who went on to become the Earls and the Dukes of Bedford, were given lots of abbey lands. They were given the old abbey lands at Tavistock. They were given monastic lands at Woburn Abbey, where you have the zoo nowadays, Woburn Zoo. And there's a reason for that as well. And it's very, very important. This family is very, very important in the history of not just the ownership of land in England, but also how it's been used, because the Earls and the later Dukes of Bedford had a pretty outsized role on some very, very big changes in land use. So, for example, their lands the monastic lands they were given in the fens of England, these low-lying areas of what used to be swampland, basically marshland. The Earl of Bedford was in the 1600s a very, very important funder of the draining of the fens. So this was this huge, basically, destruction of an ecosystem in order to create dry lands for growing crops on. And it was a form of something else as well. It was a form of enclosure. And this is, I think, the third really important moment in the history of land ownership in England, which is the enclosure movement. And this was not something that was really initiated by the crown. It was initiated more by the aristocracy and landed gentry, who wanted to take over more land for themselves. They wanted to arrogate more land to themselves. And they had spied another way in which to do this, which was to enclose common land. Now, common land is land that historically covered a very large area. In fact, in the time of Shakespeare, it probably covered about 30% of England. And today it covers very, very, very much less land. But what it is essentially is it's land that may be owned by someone else, but over which there are third-party rights. So if you're a commoner, you get to graze your cattle on a common over which you have rights, for example, or you get to collect firewood or
bring out your pigs.
Yeah.
Bring out your pigs.
Yeah. And anyone interested in common land should listen back to the episodes with Katrina Navickas, where we talk in quite a lot of detail about some of those very specific sets of rights. And also about some of the contrasts with the slightly mythologized idea of the commons, this sort of idealized sense of it.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Katrina's a fantastic historian. So, yes.
It's just amazing. As you were talking, there are so many times when your name has come up in our past episodes. I'm now thinking of those as you're talking through everything, which is amazing.
I'm thinking of future episodes because I'm thinking Duke of Bedford. We need to go deep dive on Dukes of Bedford because, in terms of the title of the podcast, Absolute Units, the Dukes of Bedford, Duke of Bedford in the late 18th, early 19th century was a major sponsor of agricultural improvement. So supported the livestock artist George Garrard, who's very well known for having created a whole series of models of the relatively newly created native breeds of the British Isles and livestock sort of paintings of these amazing breeds, all supported by the same Duke of Bedford at Woburn. So, critical intersections there too.
Well, and another Duke of Bedford we have to thank for the introduction of grey squirrels to this country. So, in terms of stewardship, you can... I'll let you decide whether that's a good example of good stewardship or of...
so the invasive grey squirrel I saw out my back window this morning, thanks Duke of Bedford.
Thanks to the Duke of Bedford, that's right.
I think this was the first mention of Thomas Cromwell as well. He hasn't been on the podcast before.
I should get him on.
We should get
him on. Yeah. But it did remind me that we have talked about another lawyer, which is Colin Firth playing a pig lawyer in the film The Advocate, where he has to defend
and we keep coming back to that, and I still haven't watched the film, so I'm feeling like a fraud. I need to go back and watch that film, but
need to watch that.
Yeah. Well, I think we should just briefly close off on common land and enclosure, but basically just to say, I mean, you've previously covered common land in more detail, but essentially this was a huge transfer of land again from not necessarily common ownership in the sense of all commoners, actually owning that land, but having rights to it, being able to have sustenance from that land in a kind of maybe sort of medieval, early modern form of welfare state, you might like to think of it as. And to suddenly have that taken away through the process of enclosure was obviously a huge change. And going from common land covering about 30% of England in the year 1600, today it covers a mere 3% of England.
Wow!
So that's a series of different enclosures. So
that's right. So there was private enclosure, and then there was parliamentary enclosure. When it was people will say, it was all legal, it was all done via Act of Parliament and so on. But other historians, notably E.P. Thompson, will say it was legalised theft. It was essentially the people who ran Parliament and were MPs, who were often landed themselves, were allowing other landed gentry, other landowners to essentially seize more lands themselves. So you had these three big moments. You had Doomsday, or rather the Norman Conquest, 1066. You had the dissolution of the monasteries and seizure of church lands in the 1530s and 1540s. And then you had the ongoing process over a period of centuries of the enclosures. I think maybe just one more, if we have time for one more kind of key moment in this history of land ownership in England is the Second Doomsday. So I mentioned earlier the Doomsday Book of 1086, and Joe, you said you hadn't heard of the Second Doomsday.
No.
Well, don't worry, you're in common with everyone else in the country pretty much that has not heard of the Second Doomsday.
To be fair, I've heard of it, but only because I've heard you talking about it before, Guy, and I've read the book, and Yeah. But so thank you for telling me about it. But tell me about it again.
Well, I learnt about it from Kevin Cahill, who wrote Who Owns Britain, which is another good book that was written about sort of 25 years ago and got me into this as well. But essentially what happened was in the 1870s, you had socialists and liberals starting to call for land reform in England. You had people calling for an extension of the franchise, for greater democracy in this country, and you had people campaigning and rebelling around the kind of inequality in England as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And the government in the 1870s decided that they wanted to actually find out whether the land reformers had a point. They wanted to look into all these claims that were being made that land was still owned in a very concentrated and unequal way. So they decided to conduct a second doomsday survey, and it was actually initiated by a number of landowning peers in the House of Lords who sort of said this would be a very good idea. So they sent out surveyors, somewhat like William the Conqueror had done all that time ago, to all the counties of England and Wales. I think a separate survey was done in Scotland. And they brought back millions of bits of data over a couple of years, tabulated the results, looked at what they found, and then realised that actually the results showed them that the land reformers were right, that you had a mere 4,000 members of the aristocracy and landed gentry who still owned half of England. So sure, you'd gone from 200 Norman barons in 1086 owning half of England to 4,000 members of the aristocracy owning half of England in 1875. Wasn't really a kind of, triumph for trickle-down economics or for mass redistribution of land.
Over the course of 800 years.
Insanely concentrated, insanely unequal. So in actual fact, what this did, and it was called the return of owners of land, but more popularly known as the Second Doomsday, and it was popularised by various writers and activists and campaigners at the time who seized on these results. So the government had sought to kind of quash these calls for land reform, and it actually was more like a kind of red rag to a bull. And this was also the time when you had people like Henry George, who was an American analyst and economist, who came up with the idea of a land value tax. And he went on a various sort of rabble-rousing tours of England at the time, kind of pointing to some of these results of this huge survey of land ownership and saying, well, actually, we should be taxing these landowners more. We should be, kind of seizing some of this wealth ultimately in the form of taxation and giving more out to support the poorest in society. And so he wrote this book called Progress and Poverty, which became quite a touchstone for socialists at the time. In fact, perhaps as influential on the English left as Karl Marx. In fact, probably more so. And he's been almost forgotten today in many quarters. So you had all this sort of ferment. Ultimately, over a period of decades, it did actually influence the Liberal Party, who kind of existed at the time, obviously, as a kind of counter to the Tories, who were much more of the party of the landed aristocracy and of the landowners. And it kind of reached its apotheosis, really, in the form of David Lloyd George, who first as Chancellor and later as Prime Minister, was probably the most keen of all of our politicians we've ever had on land reform. He did actually bring in briefly a land value tax, but it kind of hit the buffers with World War I, got in the way, and the implementation of it proved to be a bit of a disaster. So again, this is something that's been almost entirely forgotten about today. It was the kind of the high point of when land was a really big political issue and it really dominated the politics of this country. I think that probably, though, is enough to bring us up to date so far as the last century, anyway, of land ownership.
It's an amazing story, and as we were talking about, sort of underpins everything, really, and all of the collections that we have. So our object collections in the museum date back, theoretically, it's sort of 1750 to the present day they cover. So we're going back not that far into this, enormous layering of history that sets these sort of standards that we all live by in relation to land, and we sort of seem to have accepted. It's a little bit like Joe sort of reflecting on his unfamiliarity with some of this history. It never really questioned it.
No,
and all of those objects, that they've played a part out there in rural environments that are owned and managed and shaped by these huge systems.
But it almost feels invisible. And it feels invisible in our collections as well to an extent. I mean, we have all of the tools that people would have used in their lives, but we don't have the land itself.
Yeah. I mean, Guy, you mentioned E.P. Thompson, classic historian of working class rural England, those amazing texts that give you a sense of the labourers that shaped and worked these landscapes. But of course, the collections that we hold, despite this being a social history collection, a kind of people's history collection, are objects. And I say this quite often on this podcast. They're objects that belonged largely not to those people. They were objects that were used by those people in those landscapes, on landscapes that they themselves did not own and didn't have the right to make decisions about. So this is the sort of critical nub of all of this, is sort of building up to the campaign work, the amazing campaign work that you've been involved in sort of bringing to the fore, I think. I mean, I don't think you would claim to be the originator of any of these sort of campaigns and ideas, because you're sort of building on the back of all those amazing people you spoke about earlier and others. But I wonder whether you could sort of introduce us to Right to Roam and how the latest iteration of Right to Roam campaigns came about, who was involved. Was this just a conversation over a pint somewhere? I like to think it was. But
Certainly, pints were drunk, and as we discussed it, yeah. So really, who initiated this was, of course, the great Nick Hayes, who, if you haven't had on a podcast yet, you should do.
He's very high on our list as well. Yeah,
and I think he's moored up on a canal boat not so far from you in Reading. So yeah, so Nick was writing his wonderful book of trespass when I first got to meet him, and we got to know one another. And I think we first met at a kind of conference or gathering called Land for What, which was again about 10 years ago now. And I think Marion Shord was there. There'd sort of been this sort of revival of interest in all things land. Had the Land Workers Alliance getting set up some years ago. You had a series called 3 Acres and a Cow. Have you come across them or featured them before?
We have currently got the washing line of history from 3 Acres of a Cow in the galleries. So, if you want to dip your toes in experiencing what 3 Acres and a Cow is, it's also a nice way of exploring that enormous period of history as well. So, come along and see the current gallery trail.
So Robin Gray and everyone who's been involved in 3 Acres and a Cow over the years, also, one of the sets of people who kind of got me really interested in this, going along to seeing a performance of 3 Acres and a Cow and hearing this kind of history of land rights in song and poetry and jokes and so on. So I think we've been talking about how do you put land back on the agenda? How do you put these questions of land ownership and access and sort of inequality of who owns land and how do we have access to it back onto the political agenda? And it was kind of sitting around in pubs and around kitchen tables where Nick and I sort of ended up talking about doing a campaign, sort of, and from that the Right to Roam campaign was born. I guess a little bit of context for that is to say that in England we do have a partial right to roam. It was brought in the year 2000 by Tony Blair's government.
This is the so-called Crow Act.
That's right. It's the Countryside and Rights of Way, or Crow Act, of the year 2000. And it gave the public a right to access mountain, moor, down and heath, as well as common land. And those are wonderful places, don't get me wrong. They're really, really lucky to live next to Dartmoor, where that's covered by open access land. But it actually only comprises 8% of England. So all of these areas of open access land, often very remote from where most people live, and overall they add up to 8% of the country. So we were like, I reckon we could probably improve on that. Maybe we should try. Why don't we have public access to woods, for example? Why don't we have public access to rivers? What about the fields that lie between these other places that we may wish to get to, and how do we sort of negotiate some form of access rights to those? And out of this came the Right to Roam campaign. It started at a time when we wanted to start off with a whole bunch of mass trespasses. Then COVID hit and lockdowns. We obviously couldn't get out and organise lots of mass trespasses immediately. So we started with a website and various articles and petitions and so on. But then in 2021, we started, as sort of the country emerged from lockdown, we started to organise mass trespasses, working with local groups around the country. Started with one in the South Downs, in fact, where you sort of think, a national park like the South Downs obviously has loads of access, right? Actually, a very, very small percentage of the South Downs National Park is actually accessible because so much of the original downland was ploughed up. And we're just left with these little fragments of areas of downland where you have a right to roam, but sometimes you actually have to even trespass to get to these places. They're called access islands, which are another kind of indictment of our broken system of access in England. And, the team grew in size. The number of people who supported right to roam grew. Our mailing list grew massively. And the number of trespasses we were able to start organising suddenly shot up. And that's basically been the story of the last 5 or 6 years or so now of the Right to Roam campaign getting established. And, there's been various political ups and downs along the way. We thought we got very close in 2023 to having a promise from what was then the opposition Labour Party, when in the aftermath of the obviously now somewhat notorious fight over wild camping on Dartmoor, when the wealthy landowner Alexander Darwell sought to extinguish the right to wild camp on Dartmoor and momentarily was able to do so through a High Court case, later overturned, and that victory was secured at the Supreme Court last year. But in the aftermath of all the publicity and the protests that happened around that case, the Labour Party started to go, well, actually, do you know what? We would introduce a wider right to roam in England. And they even said, do you know what? We'll do what you've been talking about recently in the Right to Roam campaign, and we will move towards a Scottish-style right to roam, or a right of responsible access. And this is the kind of crazy thing, really, is when you go to the Scottish-English border, as indeed we did do on one of our mass trespasses, and you stand there. We were organising along this place called the Scots Dyke, which is this big straight line that's been drawn along the border for reasons of history. And you put one foot in England and you're trespassing, and you put your other foot in Scotland and you have a right to be there. You have a right of responsible access. And both of those decisions were made, that difference is really just down to politics, and it's down to legislation. And in 2003, a Labour-led government in Scotland implemented the Land Reform Act that country now has, and that created a right of responsible access to the vast majority of land and water in Scotland. Whereas in England, we've had to settle for essentially crumbs from the table. We've settled for something that's a much more compromised, negotiated, piecemeal settlement that we think doesn't really serve the public anymore.
Yeah, it feels balmy to me because I, of course, grew up in the Scottish borders, and actually my father used to rent a hill farm from the Roxburgh Estates that was right on the border. So I've spent time right up there on the border at that march between Scotland and England, stepping back and forth through fairly rundown fences that supposedly secure that march. And it's just ridiculous. When I first moved down to England, it never really struck me that I wasn't allowed to just walk more or less where I please. So I think I still carry with me that sense of, the right to wander wherever I want. Mass trespassing more by accident than by design, I think. But, it does seem ridiculous, really.
It absolutely is. And obviously one of the things that we've tried to encourage people to do is to just trespass, is to live and to act as if you're already free. But we also know that to do that requires a certain amount of confidence, often a certain amount of privilege. And we know that actually to kind of secure access for everybody, we do need rights, and we need that right as a backstop in order to say, well, if a landowner, for example, wishes to prevent people from accessing the countryside, going and actually confronting them when they find them out on their land, or putting up fences and barbed wire and so on, then you need that backstop of a legal right. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is to change the law. We don't want to have to trespass anymore. We'd like to change the law so that England has something similar to Scotland, and that we have a right of responsible access here. And I'd like to emphasise also responsible, because that is something we take really seriously. Often people will say to us, oh, well, the right to roam, what about responsibilities? And I sort of feel like we've been banging on about this from the very outset. One of our first campaign stories that we did was an investigation into how much the government in England had been actually promoting the Countryside Code, which is obviously meant to govern how, people act in the countryside. It turned out that they'd been spending a grand total of, drumroll, £2,000 a year promoting the Countryside Code between 2010 and 2020. So, austerity clearly bit on promoting the Countryside Code as well as in everything else.
Code.
I guess it's worth mentioning that the Countryside Code comes in alongside national parks, which in turn come on the back of a sort of sustained series of mass trespasses and other campaign work at an earlier stage. So these campaigns do work.
Exactly right, and very much we are simply trying to pick up tactics that have worked before in history, and the history of the Kinderscout mass trespass, of other mass trespasses like that happened as well as long ago as the 1890s in places like Winter Hill, up near Bolton. Really, really important parts of our history. Something that in the Right to Roam campaign we're very much aware of and sort of in awe of, and trying to kind of pass on the baton, as it were, or collect the baton from previous campaigns that have done these sorts of tactics.
So just going back a little bit,
Could
you talk a little bit about the government land use consultation and the news, like the very recent news about, who really owns England?
Yeah, sure. So just a tiny bit of context. So I've obviously talked to you about various doomsday surveys that have been done by different governments over the centuries. Since the late 19th century, there has been also this body called the Land Registry. And the Land Registry is meant to be the official registrar of who owns land in both England and in Wales. But it still hasn't actually finished its job. It still hasn't actually done the one thing it was set up to do back 160 odd years ago, which is to register all the land. And so we still don't know who owns some of the land in England and Wales. I think it's now down to about 10%. So they have been making progress, but it's still not finished. A bigger issue from my perspective is that all of the information they do have is locked behind a paywall. And if you want to find out who owns a field, say, a single land parcel, previously you had to pay £3 for that, for every single land parcel. That went up recently to £7, the price of a London pint now, for every land parcel. So you can find out who owns a single field if you pay your £7. But there are 24 million land parcels registered at the Land Registry. So that's something like £168 million if you want to find out who owns all of England and Wales.
Cut significantly down on the number of pints you can drink to plan Right to Roam campaigns.
Really would
shell out that kind of money.
The campaign, absolutely. I should say we don't have a beer budget. We're absolutely skint. So please do donate to the Right to Roam campaign if I can get in a plug for that.
Yeah.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
I'm fairly certain Guy, Nick, and his fellow Right to Roamers are not spending that on pints. So
I'm afraid we are not. We really are not. So it would cost £168 million if you wanted to find out who owns all of England and Wales. And obviously, none of us have that kind of requisite spare cash down the back of the sofa. So what I've been doing for the last 10 years now, literally, has been to campaign for that information to be made free and open to the public, because I think it is a matter of public interest that we know who owns the country beneath our feet and that we all live in. And whilst at times in the last 10 years it's felt like a completely fruitless cause, actually at other times and more recently, I've been feeling a lot more hopeful about it. And in the last few years particularly, wasn't just as a result of the new government coming to power, but there was some interest before the election as well from some of the officials within the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, who ultimately have kind of sway over the Land Registry. But it's really sort of sped up in recent years, and there's been some very, very hard work being done by officials behind the scenes. There's been some interest from ministers like Minister Matt Pennycook, the Housing Minister, and increasingly interest in the Department for the Environment as well. And this is where we get to the land use framework that you just mentioned, Joe. So I've actually got it here. Got a copy of it here, just to Not sure that's going to show up in a podcast, but I've got it here.
Sounds good. I could hear
sounds good. The sound
hear the
came
pages.
You can hear the pages, this historic document creaking open like a latter-day doomsday book. But it is actually a really important document, I think. It is, to me, it's actually it's one of the more historic documents that's been produced on this subject of land. Partly because actually so few governments have paid attention to it for so long. But I sort of, when I was doing some media work around it, I said that I think this is the most important plan for land that we've had in England since the Second World War, and I would stand by that. It does many things to do with how we should be using land in a more rational way, how we should be restoring nature over more of our landscapes, how we should be ensuring that there are win-wins with food production and with the provision of affordable housing. There are things that I disagree with in it, but there's also something that I'm very excited about because it does finally say something that I've been saying for a very long time and many others have been saying for even longer, which is that the government now intends to open up the land registry and tell us who owns land in this country. And for something to go from what began for me as a blog 10 years ago to becoming government policy is pretty exciting. And, I am quite elated by what's happened.
Comparing the speed of that with the 700 years, it took for landowners to change from 200 to 4,000 is astonishing. So what an achievement.
Or even the 160 so years that it took the land registry to register not all of the land. You should be immensely proud of yourself, Guy. And I had a quick flick back through some of the Who Owns England blog and could see on there the amazing amount of work that you've put in over the years. Some of your responses to consultations around land, really detailed, amazing work that you've played a part in all of this. So, all credit to you.
Thank you very much. And obviously, as always, these sorts of campaigns are built by many people doing things over the years. And, if you want to read more about them, I name quite a lot of them in my books and on my blog. So please do read more about those campaigns. I would just emphasise, though, that nothing is over until it's over. And so although it's become now official government policy to tell us who owns England, we don't yet have the answer still to that question. And it may be that the government has to consult on this, that there may be further obstacles put in the way. There's undoubtedly going to be a backlash at some point from perhaps from larger landowners who don't want this information to be made public, perhaps, at which point I will certainly be picking up the campaign once again and asking people to get involved, whether that's through submitting views to a forthcoming government consultation or in other ways. So yes, definitely need people to be still vigilant on this and getting involved if you care about issues like land.
And presumably, Guy, just to sort of finish off on that, some of the owners of the land in England are going to be quite complex organizational owners, institutional owners, shell companies, those kind of things, rather than, we've talked obviously a lot about aristocratic landowners and the barons and the 200 to the 4,000 and those
the Alexander Darwalls and people like that.
And individuals, named individuals who you can point to as a person who owns a tract of land, who is the person who's decided they're the steward and is making the decisions. But some of it's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it? So even if we open it up.
Absolutely. And we know that corporations, companies own a significant swathe of England today. We do know that from some of the information that has been made available by Land Registry over the years. And then, as you say, piecing together then, some of that information can be investigated by things like Companies House and other measures that have been implemented in recent years to try and peer through the kind of corporate opacity. But, capitalism has lots of ways of concealing what it does as well. And, you mentioned there offshore companies. I think offshore companies are often cloaked in secrecy, established in offshore jurisdictions, some of which are tax havens, many of which will not be keen to reveal the ultimate owners of a company who might own a large chunk of England. So, yes, the detective story will continue. The investigations will have to continue. And, ultimately people will have to remain, interested in land and interested in investigating who owns land and how it's used. Because I think that's ultimately how we make a change, is we remain interested in this issue and are constantly thinking of new ways to campaign and to draw attention to something that is too often seen as invisible. The land around us, the land beneath our feet. It has to become something that's ever present in our lives, I think.
I wanted to sort of round things off with just a nod to something that I noticed on one of your blog posts. And I think I saw you speaking about and sharing images of these at one of these sort of government land use framework launch events some time ago, which is the land utilisation survey, Dudley Stamp's land utilisation survey. Largely because it's such a kind of nice grassroots story of how you research and understand land. Could you tell us a little bit briefly about that, and then maybe we'll finish things off there.
Absolutely. So, about 100 years ago, there was this wonderful eminent geographer called Lawrence Dudley Stamp, and he became famous in his own day because he produced one of the first maps of Britain that looked at land use. So prior to him, you obviously had ordnance survey maps that, kind of in black and white would show you where field boundaries were and where settlements were and where roads went. But what Dudley Stamp wanted to do was kind of literally, as a geographer, colour in the map to show how land was being used in different ways. So, for example, to actually understand whether large swathes of East Anglia were arable versus pasture farming, for example, or whether land was heathland or moorland or orchards and things like that. So in order to do this back in the 1930s, when Dudley Stamp was operating, you couldn't use satellite technology. That didn't exist. You couldn't use GIS digital mapping. That didn't exist. So what did Dudley Stamp do, as any good geography teacher does? Well, he told his pupils, the pupils of Britain, to go out and colour in some maps. And literally tens of thousands of school children took part in preparing the land utilisation survey of Great Britain by going out on geography field trips and taking with them ordnance survey maps and colouring in with coloured pencils and wax crayons and so on what was growing in the fields. So there was a very strict colour scheme. Fields with crops growing in were coloured in brown, moorland and heath were coloured yellow, grassland light green, as you might expect, woodland shaded dark green. And then to spice it up a bit, you had built-up areas were shaded in red, and gardens and allotments were signed with the colour purple. So you ended up with these beautiful, colourful maps. I've seen a number of them. Some of them are in the National Archives nowadays. Some of them, I think, have been reprinted. But they are really, really beautiful works of art, really, as well as incredibly useful historical maps for understanding how land was used nearly 100 years ago. And then seeing how that land use has changed in England is really, really vital as well, to see how things have either become more built up, but also how agriculture has become more intensive. More of our ancient woods have been cut down and things have changed significantly in the last century.
It feels like an amazing example of crowdsourced material as well. So many people on such a large scale coming together. And I guess that's at the heart of Right to Roam and all of these, campaign victories is it's not individual people. It's the sum of many, many people combining for a cause.
Absolutely. And, if you want to come on a mass trespass with us as well, with the Right to Roam campaign, then we're organising many more and have many more local groups that are getting set up around the country, which people can get involved with as well.
Making landscapes accessible to future generations who will become landscape literate, like the children of interwar Britain who completed those extraordinary maps and could tell what a crop was. And yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
Well, yeah. What a nice way to end a really amazing conversation. So brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Guy.
Thanks
we're looking forward to chatting with you next time about hunting. So that'll be interesting.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is.
Thank you so much for listening to Absolute Units. I've been Vaughan and my co-host is Dr. Ollie Douglas. Absolute Units is made possible through Museums Partnership Reading, an Arts Council funded partnership of the Mull and Reading Museum. We'll be back with Guy in 2 weeks' time to talk about hunting, specifically the modern manifestation of shooting in English landscapes. We're going to talk about hunting's links to land use, to problematic stewardship of rural space, and delve into the thorny challenges of invoking rural tradition. See you next time.